I spent yesterday afternoon wrestling with two completely different computer systems, side by side. The one on the left was a digital, fossil, ancient, tangled spaghetti code with zero documentation. Just looking at it gave me a headache. Yet, against all logic, it was bulletproof. It just ran. Then there was the system on the right, a massive, modern refactoring project meant to integrate everything perfectly. But the second I poked around, I found these digital ghosts, fragments of old programs still haunting the background, causing glitches in the sleek new interface. And in that moment of frustration, the screen sort of faded away, and I was suddenly back in Nairobi, then Johannesburg. And it struck me that these aren't just IT problems, they are perfect metaphors for how entire civilizations function. One society operating like that resilient legacy code and written rules, deep tribal kernel drivers, and a chaotic but functional flow. The other, a nation attempting a total system rewrite, desperately trying to debug the lingering malicious code of apartheid while building a new interface. It forces us to ask, what if we could actually view the source code of a culture?
Well, viewing culture through the lens of code is an incredibly powerful way to think about it. It lets us analyze the logic, the specific functions and the conditional statements that determine how people organize themselves, how they interact, how they establish loyalty. We can move beyond just observing differences and start understanding the underlying mechanism is shaping beliefs and, well, history itself.
Exactly. So for this deep dive, that's our mission, to analyze the source code of culture in Kenya and South Africa. We're looking at two vastly different systems, Kenya's decentralized, resilient legacy code versus South Africa's monumental, ambitious refactoring project. We want to understand the system architecture, its bugs, its resilience, and the trade-offs that are inherent in both designs.
So if we start with Kenya, the foundational architecture is really defined by what you could call decentralized diversity. The system logic isn't built on a single unified national protocol. It's fundamentally constructed from multiple distinct tribal structures, the Kikuyu, the Luo, the Maasai, the Kalenjin, the Luya, and dozens more.
We can think of these as core modules, or, to stick with the metaphor, kernel drivers. They're running constantly in the background, defining how the whole system operates, even if the user on top isn't really aware of it. And these aren't just historical labels, are they? These modules dictate identity, social structure, core values.
Oh, absolutely. Take, for instance, the Maasai. Their entire social architecture, the rules for marriage, for wealth accumulation, for intergroup relations, it's all encoded within their specific warrior culture. Yeah. And that deep, deep connection to cattle. Cattle aren't just assets in that system. They're the medium of exchange, the symbol of status, and really the central data point in their entire economy and social hierarchy. That's a highly detailed fundamental code library specific to just that one module.
And the method of code transmission for this legacy system is fascinating because it doesn't rely on centralized documentation. It's primarily oral history, proverbs, and songs, which forms what we can call a living database of collective memory.
The fact that it's a living database is the key. The elders function as the master servers. They hold and transmit this massive data set. But the knowledge isn't static like you'd find in a printed law book. It's constantly being reinterpreted and confirmed through shared experience and community storytelling, which allows the system to adapt and heal itself in a decentralized way.
But then you introduce the rapid modern environment of Nairobi. This is the new high-speed UI overlay. And it's forcing these diverse kernel drivers to interact constantly. To avoid total communication failure, this interface demands common APIs.
And that's where English and Swahili step in. They act as essential communication protocols. Swahili provides the lingua franca for daily life, for basic commerce, while English often serves as the protocol for, say, higher education, formal government, and international business.
And what about the genius of community workarounds? You see things like Sheng Street slang, a constantly evolving mix of Swahili, English, and various tribal languages. That is basically a user-developed patch designed to make high-speed urban communication smoother, more colorful, and relevant to the youth. It shows the code's malleability, doesn't it?
It does. However, the friction point remains immense. Even with this slick, modern urban interface, that deep underlying tribal code is always humming away in the background. It continues to shape political loyalties, social networks, and fundamental identity, often overriding the national API during moments of stress.
And this is exactly where we see the atomization bugs start to emerge. We came across this anecdote about Nuroj, a young app developer living in the trendy Kilimani district of Nairobi. He's the ideal user of this modern urban UI. He's hyper-individualistic, sees himself as a global citizen, and he's actively trying to overwrite the multi-threaded kinship obligations he inherited.
Right. He's optimized his life for speed and individual capital accumulation. He sees traditional collective systems as slow, inefficient, and potentially blocking his personal progress. But then the legacy code activates, often through a surprisingly modern vector. He gets a mandatory addition to a kinship WhatsApp group.
And the message is a call for Harambe.
A demand for collective responsibility.
Exactly. To fund a distant cousin's wedding dowry. For Njorug, this is a system crash. His individualist operating system is now in direct conflict with his kinship kernel driver.
And this clash is the fundamental stress test on the Kenyan system. Historically, the traditional tribal system provided that crucial social safety net, a kind of redundant server backup. If one part of the family network failed, the others covered the cost. It guaranteed survival.
But Njorug, isolated in his modern apartment, he looks at this demand and feels violated. He's invested in the new OS, sacrificing those deep social connections for personal mobility, and now the old system is demanding payment for a service he didn't explicitly request or even use.
This is what the great sociologist Emile Durkheim termed anomie, a profound condition that results from a breakdown of social norms and a lack of moral regulation. Njorug feels like a corrupted file, disconnected from the root directory, just floating in a high-speed, lonely cache. The new urban system gave him tremendous speed and opportunity, but in deleting those kinship protocols, he may have stripped away his firewall against deep social loneliness and, well, meaninglessness.
So the core risk in Kenya's rapid modernization isn't just about inefficiency, it's about deleting those deep-root social glue protocols in favor of this Western-style atomization. You end up with a high-performing system that is vulnerable to catastrophic social crashes because the redundant backups are all gone.
And this legacy code is, unfortunately, often exploited for political gain, which leads directly to resource conflict and political tribalism. This brings up the concept of Mijimboism, or provincial autonomy.
This wasn't just some abstract political term. It was a calculated narrative used by powerful political groups, like the Kanu Cabal in the early 1990s, to mobilize ethnic fear. The idea drew directly from colonial-era anxieties, specifically the fear of domination by the largest ethnic group, the Kikuyu, even though no single community in Kenya actually holds a numerical majority.
It was a way of policing boundaries.
Yeah.
The Mijimbo rallies in the early 90s were terrifyingly real. They led to violence, death, and massive displacement. They actively undermined any chance for trans-ethnic political organizing by making people fear the other. The narrative was designed to make certain groups feel victimized, lending itself to the lament among some commentators about the perceived burden of being Kikuyu in a highly politicized environment.
And the rhetoric used by the barons driving this conflict is a perfect illustration of what the scholar Mahmoud Mamdani calls the bifurcated world. These individuals are essentially violent ethnic barons who operate using two incompatible sets of protocols at the same time.
In the rural areas, they act as ethnic chiefs. They leverage custom and make threats against outsiders to control local resources, especially land. They're relying on the deepest level of the legacy, code tribal loyalty, and collective ownership narratives.
But when they're accumulating wealth in the city or dealing with international partners, they switch protocols entirely. They use pure liberal rhetoric, insisting on private property rights and the sanctity of the market, which of course facilitates their own accumulation of capital. It's a dual operating system designed to maximize power and profit at every single level.
The land dispute at Etek Farm in the Rift Valley is a classic example of this friction. You had Nandi squatters occupying the land, claiming it based on ancestral usage and their moral contract as former laborers. And they were resisting these opaque and exclusionary land transactions orchestrated by powerful figures.
What's fascinating about the Etek case, though, is that we saw local resistance attempt to forge a powerful trans-ethnic politics of cooperation. Kikuyu municipal councilors in Eldoret publicly declared that the Kikuyu community risked too much by buying these lands without the explicit approval of the Nandi community. This was a clear political move to distance themselves from the wealthy Kikuyu buyers who were tied to the centralized power clique.
And this showed that when local systems activate, the messy, localized negotiation can sometimes resist that centralized manipulation. Local nationalism can fight back against centralized corruption, insisting that land rights should be negotiated based on publicly accepted, transparent transactions that respect both historic claims and moral contracts. But we have to acknowledge that political tribalism maintains a critical advantage: the monopoly on violence, which has historically been very effective in maintaining the clique's grip on power without international consequence.
It's the resilient chaos of the legacy code. It survives, it adapts, but its decentralized nature makes it vulnerable to political manipulation that leverages those ancient loyalties. The atomization bug is fighting against the social glue, and the political elite are weaponizing the conflict. This deep dive really shows us the sheer complexity of a system that grew organically over centuries. Now let's take a breath and move to a nation that looked at its own deeply poisoned legacy code and said, we must burn it all down and write a new operating system from scratch. This shift is massive, moving from Kenya's decentralized diversity to South Africa's system rewrite.
South Africa's architecture is defined by that massive intentional system refactoring, immediately following the end of apartheid. The initial legacy code, the apartheid code, was perhaps the most maliciously efficient, rigidly hierarchical, and divisive system ever implemented.
It wasn't just segregation. It was a comprehensive, systematic architecture built on racial classification. It dictated every facet of life, from where you could live and work to who you could marry. And even though that code was officially scrapped in 1994, its lingering effects are those persistent bugs that continue to plague the system. The profound economic gaps, deep social distrust, and the segregated urban layout that remains functionally rigid.
The intention behind the new system was aspirational. The Rainbow Nation OS, an inclusive framework built on equality and multiculturalism designed to run concurrent cultures. Zulu, Xhosa, Afrikaner, Indian, colored with 11 official languages, all on an equitable platform.
And the new kernel of this entire ambitious system is the 1996 Constitution. This didn't just appear overnight, did it? It was a result of a deliberate, protracted process known as transitional constitutionalism, starting with the Codice negotiations in the early 1990s and the 1993 interim constitution.
That interim constitution was guided by 34 constitutional principles, the CPs. This is a critical detail that I think a lot of people overlook. These CPs weren't suggestions. They became the unamendable core of the final system.
So what specifically did those 34 CPs guarantee? Because that sounds like the architects were pre-installing some powerful fail-safes.
Precisely. They were guarantees made to various negotiating parties, especially the historically advantaged minority, that certain non-negotiable standards would endure regardless of who won the first fully democratic election. These included, fundamentally, a single common South African citizenship, the guaranteed enjoyment of universally accepted fundamental rights, the separation of powers, the supremacy of the Constitution, and crucial protections for minority parties in the political system. They ensured the new OS couldn't be hijacked by a single Democratic majority immediately upon launch.
And that focus on constitutional supremacy had a huge consequence: the intentional empowerment of the judiciary. The CPs explicitly guaranteed the power and jurisdiction of the Constitutional Court to safeguard and enforce this new constitution.
That empowerment was the ultimate systemic check. The Constitutional Court was required to certify that the final constitutional text adhered to all 34 CPs. This established the judiciary as an essential arbiter, ensuring that the new government couldn't simply dispense with the negotiated limits that were established during the transition.
However, a key component of that transition, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC, it sought to achieve national reconciliation through limited amnesty, public accountability, and forgiveness. But it had a major flaw in its scope.
Yes, the TRC focused overwhelmingly on political violence and human rights abuses. It largely sidestepped the economic and social injustices embedded by apartheid, the forced removals, the deep educational stratification, and the fundamentally exploitative migrant labor system. It offered political and emotional redress without providing structural economic reform.
And the failure to address those foundational economic harms has profoundly undermined the perceived legitimacy of the new system in the eyes of many. If the policies that systematically impoverished millions remain uncorrected and the economic distribution looks much the same, the political transition feels incomplete, like a change in UI without a change in the core resource allocation protocols.
And this is where the system contestation begins, often articulated by political parties like the Economic Freedom Fighters, the EFF, and internal elements of the ruling ANC calling for a second transition. They argue that the persistent failings in service delivery, in governance, and increasing inequality are not implementation bugs, but are attributable to the Constitution's negotiated status and its underlying liberal legal order.
They're essentially promoting nullification, a rejection of the existing Constitution, and a demand for a completely new political and economic order, arguing that the present structure is illegitimate because it failed to sufficiently address the legacies of racism and inequality.
But here's the paradox. Despite the rhetoric of nullification, we observe a pervasive dynamic called lawfare. This is the embrace of legal institutions by every single competing faction within political parties, government departments, and social actors to achieve political advantage or access to resources.
I wonder if we can apply that same logic to the system itself. If every major government policy, every internal party conflict, and every political disagreement ends up being challenged in the Constitutional Court, doesn't that prove the system is actually working as designed, even if it's slow and expensive? Or is the pervasive reliance on the courts actually a sign of political failure, indicating that the legislature and the executive just can't achieve consensus?
It's both. It is profoundly expensive and often frustratingly slow lawfare drains resources and delays service delivery. But ironically, every time the EFF or dissenting ANC factions utilize the courts to challenge corruption or policy, they are implicitly validating the Constitution's supremacy and embedding constitutionalism more deeply into the national political identity. The system is stressed, but its core judicial function is robustly active.
Let's dive into the ideological friction that generates the most heat in the South African OS. This is the constant system diagnostic flagging competing algorithms. The clash between meritocracy, the idea of blind technical competence and inclusion, the need for historical correction.
We heard the anecdote about Peter, the senior civil engineer in Pretoria. Peter sees the world through the lens of pure functionality. He is focused on load-bearing capacity, safety factors, and maximizing CPU cycles. For him, the new OS is simply bloated with non-technical conditional statements.
And his primary point of frustration came during a critical water sanitation tender meeting, where the technically superior firm lost the bid to a firm that scored higher on BBE compliance. I can absolutely understand Peter's frustration here. If I were relying on that infrastructure, I'd want the firm with the best technical specs.
And this highlights the deep tension. Peter views BBBE, Black Economic Empowerment, as a set of conditional statements unrelated to the engineering kernel, essentially a security vulnerability that risks system failure. BBBE is a complex scorecard system designed to ensure that previously marginalized groups participate equitably in the economy, covering areas like ownership, management control, skills development, and procurement.
So the system is prioritizing a social outcome inclusion over the execution algorithm technical merit. How does the new OS justify this trade-off to someone like Peter, who is focused purely on system stability?
The justification is that the system must correct for prior systematic malice. If the system were truly blind, it would simply perpetuate the advantages handed down by apartheid. The goal of BBBE is not just wealth distribution, but the creation of a stable, inclusive, long-term economy where the majority of the population are active participants. The risk, however, is exactly what Peter fears. The OS prioritizing the user interface, social inclusion over the kernel technical execution, leading to immediate inefficiency and potential infrastructural failure.
And this clash brings us directly to the classical liberal critique of the South African Refactoring project, championed by organizations like the Institute of Race Relations, or IRR. They argue that the entire refactoring violates fundamental classical liberal principles.
Their framework is often rooted in 4 key principles. The first is individual judgment. Society should judge you solely as an individual based on your beliefs and personal capacity, opposing all race-based policies like affirmative action or BEE as inherently discriminatory.
But the counterpoint to that is that the historical classification of race in South Africa was never voluntary. It was the mechanism of oppression. So affirmative action can be viewed as a temporary corrective demographic classification intended to promote human flourishing across the entire population, with the express goal of eventually evolving past the need for any race-based criteria whatsoever. It's a short-term bug fix aimed at achieving a long-term, truly blind system.
Their second principle is the sanctity of absolute property rights, which they see as the building block of society. They argue the state should never have the power to appropriate property, viewing state intervention as a fundamental violation of individual liberty.
Yet we have to remember the intellectual fathers of classical liberalism. John Locke himself made it clear that property rights were conditional. They were contingent on not impeding others' opportunities to acquire something similar, and crucially, preventing resource wastage. If we follow Locke's own logic, he might have entertained an explanation of how land appropriation under certain conditions could actually serve the liberal cause by preventing mass wastage of human opportunity.
The third principle is limited government interference. The government has no place interfering in your business or personal affairs as long as your actions do not harm anyone else. This is often described as the night watchman state.
But we already accept a wide variety of justified exceptions to that rule. We don't just fine people after they cause a car accident. We prohibit behavior that tends to lead to harm. like driving while intoxicated, even if no accident has occurred yet. The debate should therefore not be about whether exceptions are never justified, but rather, what are the legitimate, fact-based boundaries for those exceptions that prevent foreseeable societal harm?
And finally, the fourth principle revolves around unrestricted free speech. You can say whatever you like, limited only by speech that leads directly to imminent physical harm. If you disagree, the onus is on you to debate it in the marketplace of ideas.
And this is the principle that has aged most poorly since the internet refactored global communication. J.S. Mill wrote his classic defense of free speech long before the age of Twitter mobs, targeted manipulation, and deep-pocketed firms purchasing massive amounts of attention to push biased narratives. We now have ample empirical evidence that humans are highly unreliable agents for separating sense from nonsense when information is weaponized, forcing a crucial reevaluation of how this principle is implemented in a modern interconnected OS.
This robust ideological friction feeds directly into the land reform deadlock. This is the most politically charged resource allocation problem in the system. There are repeated calls to amend the Constitution to remove the willing buyer, willing seller, or WBS standard, which is widely blamed for the painfully slow pace of land reform.
Right. WBS has become this political lightning rod. It's held up as the constitutional anchor that protects white property rights and simultaneously as the central barrier to equitable distribution.
We need to clarify one of the most persistent system misdiagnoses here. The 1996 Constitution does not contain the willing buyer, willing seller standard. The Constitution, under Section 25, sets broad, clear criteria for compensation in expropriation based on what is just and equitable, taking into account factors like current use, the history and manner of acquisition, and state investment in the property.
So if the WBS term isn't in the new Constitution, why does the political system keep running that protocol?
Because the WBS standard is found in the Apartheid-era Expropriation Act of 1975, which remains the statutory framework used by the state for eminent domain. Because the state exercises its power of eminent domain within the terms granted by the legislature in that 1975 statute, the continuance of this law privileges existing freehold title holders. It places much higher burdens on the state for compensation than the Constitution itself actually requires.
So the Constitution isn't the problem. The system is running a deeply flawed, outdated 1975 subroutine that overrides the more equitable principles of the 1996 kernel. The political focus on WBS, however, also serves a symbolic purpose, given the tumultuous history of land conflicts in the region, particularly Zimbabwe. It's a marker of constitutional legitimacy that political leaders use to signal their commitment, or lack thereof, to radical reform.
Ultimately, the slow pace of land reform is less about strict constitutional limits. The framework actually offers broad scope for aggressive action, and more about political failure or sheer government ineptitude. The moment for aggressive constitutional change has passed, especially since the ruling party no longer commands the two-thirds majority required to unilaterally amend the Bill of Rights.
The system has the capacity to refactor its resource allocation, but the political gridlock and the complex reliance on outdated legacy laws keep gumming up the works, leading to frustration and increasing the rhetoric of nullification. Let's run the system diagnostics on the output of this massive refactoring project. 20 years on, South Africa remains stubbornly one of the most unequal countries in the world. The polarization is severe, blocked by a lack of social capital across racial and economic divides.
And the hard data confirms the persistence. The racial patterns entrenched by apartheid policies remain dominant. Black individuals still make up the overwhelming majority of the poor, and this economic inequality is not just transitory. It is profoundly persistent and socially embedded in the architecture of society.
This persistence raises a fundamental question about the system's architecture. Are the poor trapped in a poverty trap, or is there a different kind of barrier to upward movement? Economists use longitudinal data to analyze this, which tracks the same people over time to understand income dynamics.
Earlier empirical findings, looking at data from 1993 to 1998, did suggest the existence of a multiple equilibrium poverty trap. This meant that the very poorest were stuck, because locally increasing marginal returns prevented them from accumulating enough initial assets to escape the lowest tier. They couldn't get the lift they needed.
But the more recent longitudinal data from the National Income Dynamics Study, NIDS, covering the 2010 to 2012 period, tells a subtler story. The analysis found no evidence of a poverty trap where those nonlinearities prevent asset accumulation at the very bottom.
Instead, the data points to a persistence threshold. Upward mobility is actually possible for much of the population up to a certain point, a level just above the usual poverty line. However, once people reach this threshold, structural income becomes highly persistent, and further upward movement is extremely difficult.
Wait, so this means the system isn't trapping people at the bottom, but it's locking them out right when they are about to make it into the stability of the middle class. That's a much more insidious kind of barrier. Mobility is restricted not by a rigid floor below, but by a very rigid ceiling above.
Exactly. You can get off the floor, but the middle-class stability barrier is incredibly difficult to breach, making poverty persistent across generations.
Now let's turn to social cohesion, which we can measure by looking at subjective well-being, who you compare yourself to, your reference group. If people feel connected across racial and economic lines, the system is cohesive. If they only compare themselves within their own group, the system is fragmented.
The pre-1994 findings were stark. Reference groups were strictly racially delineated. Comparisons were only made to others of the same race. Spatially, the results were complex. Close neighbors, residential clusters, entered the utility function positively, the convivial village hypothesis, suggesting altruism. But the income of more distant others, district income, entered negatively, the invidious village hypothesis reflecting envy or resentment.
So how has post-apartheid integration shifted these comparison metrics according to the 2008 NIDS data?
The spatial findings largely hold true. Positive correlation with close neighbors and negative or insignificant correlation with distant others. People still feel altruistic toward those immediately around them and potentially resentful of groups doing well further away.
And the racial comparison. In 1993, the weight placed on one's own race, the race parameter, was statistically equal to 1, meaning comparisons were entirely race-specific.
In 2008, the analysis showed a subtle shift. The race parameter is no longer statistically equal to 1, meaning some measurable weight is placed on other races in one's subjective well-being function. Integration has begun to shift the metrics slightly. However, and this is the crucial point, the overwhelming majority of weight is still placed on one's own race group. Racial delineation persists, reflecting a society that remains highly fragmented at its core.
So if the path out of poverty isn't blocked by a simple poverty trap, but by this persistence threshold and fragmented social cohesion, what is the most powerful lever this system can pull for upward mobility?
The data points decisively to school quality. The highly stratified public school system is one of the most indelible legacies enforcing the poverty cycle. Historically, white schools, HWS, received vastly superior resources and funding under apartheid, and even after funding equalization, the quality divide persists due to factors like legacy resources, experienced teacher retention, and curriculum coverage.
This quality divide is so significant that poor Black parents are forced to utilize an exit option, sending their children to former HWS outside their immediate neighborhoods, often traveling great distances, because they view it as the critical stepping stone into the middle class.
And we can measure the profound impact of this choice using sophisticated value-added models that account for measurement error and the unobserved ability of the child. The data confirms that attending a former white school provides a massive, statistically significant educational premium.
How massive is the advantage gained by making that switch?
The premium is 0.7 of a standard deviation in literacy and 0.5 in numeracy. To put that into real-world educational progress, it translates to more than a year's worth of learning compared to staying in a historically Black school. This confirms that addressing and improving school quality for previously disadvantaged communities provides one of the most powerful and effective pathways out of poverty persistence for Black children in South Africa. It's the highest leverage point in the system.
This brings us to our final diagnosis, system resilience. Let's bring the Kenya and South Africa models back into direct contrast. Kenya's codebase is decentralized, built on ancient roots and weaving inherent diversity. South Africa's is a complex refactoring project grappling with recent, painful history. How do these architectures handle macro crisis?
We can use the real-world observations of Sarah, a logistics consultant who splits her time working in Johannesburg and Nairobi, as a system stress test. She compared how each country responded during a week of severe civil unrest, a massive, unexpected system bug.
In South Africa, the refactored OS hit a major bug: widespread political protest and highway blockades. Because the South African system relies heavily on rigid, centralized, formal structures, clean lines of communication, formal supply chains, the minute those centralized choke points failed, the entire system became vulnerable.
When the highways froze, the formal supply chain seized entirely. That rigidity exploited security vulnerabilities immediately, leading to panic buying, widespread looting, and a total breakdown of essential services in affected areas. The system proved profoundly brittle because it relied entirely on central authority and predictable protocols. When a central server went down, the whole grid collapsed.
2 days later, Sarah was in Nairobi during similar localized unrest. Kenya's system, the spaghetti code, is inherently messy, chaotic, and decentralized. When the main roads were blocked, the informal, multi-threaded community protocols activated immediately.
The Matatus, the informal transportation network, simply drove over sidewalks, cut through dirt paths, and relied on localized negotiation and community connections to keep goods and people moving. There was inefficiency, sure, but the system did not freeze. Local food markets kept functioning because the supply chain was already decentralized and informal.
The Kenyan system, while inefficient and frustrating in normal times, proved highly anti-fragile during the crisis. It didn't crash because it didn't rely on central authority or clean, formal structures to function. Its redundancy was built into its chaos and its reliance on local, resilient social glue.
And this comparison is crucial because it challenges the fundamental assumption that clean code, South Africa's high-minded constitutional and formalized structure, is inherently superior to the spaghetti code of Kenya's informal, messy connections. South Africa refactored for elegance and equity, but created a centralized environment where one bug brings down the grid. Kenya's architecture, while messy and prone to internal friction, provides alternative protocols and local redundancy for collective survival when the state-level OS fails. Viewing cultures as these complex rule-based systems changes the perspective from judging which system is better to appreciating the sheer complexity and constant evolution of human social code. Both systems involve inherent painful trade-offs. Kenya gained speed and decentralized resilience, but risked atomization and social loneliness. South Africa pursued monumental ambition for legal equality, but created a brittle system relying on complex centralized structures and judicial oversight. The challenge for both is the same: managing the friction between inherited logic and aspirational rewrite.
Understanding this underlying logic, the patterns, and the deeply ingrained algorithms driving our shared and varied human experience is the ultimate value of this deep dive. If we accept that no system is bug-free and that centralized elegance risks brittleness while decentralized chaos risks inequality, the question we must ask ourselves is, what essential flaw are we willing to tolerate for our survival?